Chapter 15 of The Cruise of the Snark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Allman. The Cruise of the Snark by Jack London. Chapter 15, Cruising in the Solomons. "Why not come along now?" said Captain Jensen to us, at Penduffryn, on the island of Guadalcanar. Charmian and I looked at each other and debated silently for half a minute. Then we nodded our heads simultaneously. It was a way we have of making up our minds to do things, and a very good way it is when one has no temperamental tears to shed over the last tin of condensed milk when it has capsized. We are living on tinned goods these days, and since mind is rumored to be an emanation of matter, our similes are naturally of the packing-house variety. "You'd better bring your revolvers along, and a couple of rifles," said Captain Jensen. "I've got 5 rifles aboard, though the one Mauser is without ammunition. Have you a few rounds to spare?" We brought our rifles on board, several handfuls of Mauser cartridges, and Wada and Nakata, the Snark's cook and cabin boy, respectively. Wada and Nakata were in a bit of a funk. To say the least, they were not enthusiastic, though never did Nakata show the white feather in the face of danger. The Solomon Islands had not dealt kindly with them. In the first place, both had suffered from Solomon sores. So had the rest of us. At the time, I was nursing 2 fresh ones on a diet of corrosive sublimate, but the 2 Japanese had had more than their share. And the sores are not nice. They may be described as excessively active ulcers. A mosquito bite, a cut, or the slightest abrasion serves for lodgment of the poison with which the air seems to be filled. Immediately the ulcer commences to eat. It eats in every direction, consuming skin and muscle with astounding rapidity. The pinpoint ulcer of the first day is the size of a dime by the second day, and by the end of the week its silver dollar will not cover it. Worse than the sores, the 2 Japanese had been afflicted with Solomon Island fever. Each had been down repeatedly with it, and in their weak, convalescent moments they were wont to huddle together on the portion of the Snark that happened to be nearest to faraway Japan, and to gaze yearningly in that direction. But worst of all, they were now brought on board the Minota for a recruiting cruise along the savage coast of Malaita. Wada, who had the worst funk, was sure that he would never see Japan again, and with bleak, lackluster eyes he watched our rifles and ammunition going on board the Minota. He knew about the Minota and her Malaita cruises. He knew that she had been captured 6 months before on the Malaita coast, that her captain had been chopped to pieces with tomahawks, and that, according to the barbarian sense of equity on that sweet isle, she owed 2 more heads. Also, a laborer on Penduffryn plantation, a Malaita boy, had just died of dysentery, and Wada knew that Penduffryn had been put in the debt of Malaita by 1 more head. Furthermore, in stowing our luggage away in the skipper's tiny cabin, he saw the axe gashes on the door where the triumphant bushmen had cut their way in. And finally, the galley stove was without a pipe, said pipe having been part of the loot. The Minota was a teak-built Australian yacht, ketch-rigged, long and lean, with a deep fin keel, and designed for harbor racing rather than for recruiting blacks. When Charmian and I came on board, we found her crowded. Her double boat's crew, including substitutes, was 15, and she had a score and more of return boys, whose time on the plantations was served and who were bound back to their bush villages. To look at, they were certainly true head-hunting cannibals. Their perforated nostrils were thrust through with bone and wooden bodkins the size of lead pencils. Numbers of them had punctured the extreme meaty point of the nose, from which protruded, straight out, spikes of turtle shell or of beads strung on stiff wire. A few had further punctured their noses with rows of holes following the curve of the nostril from lip to point. Each ear of every man had from 2 to a dozen holes in it, holes large enough to carry wooden plugs 3 inches in diameter down to tiny holes in which were carried clay pipes and similar trifles. In fact, so many holes did they possess that they lacked ornaments to fill them, and when, the following day, as we neared Malaita, we tried out our rifles to see that they were in working order, there was a general scramble for the empty cartridges, which were thrust forthwith into the many aching voids in our passengers' ears. At the time we tried out our rifles, we put up our barbed wire railings. The Minota, crown-decked, without any house, and with a rail 6 inches high, was too accessible to boarders. Some brass stanchions were screwed into the rail, and a double row of barbed wire stretched around her from stem to stern and back again, which was all very well as protection from savages, but it was mighty uncomfortable to those on board when the Minota took to jumping and plunging in a seaway. When one dislikes sliding down upon the lee rail barbed wire, and when he dares not catch hold of the weather rail barbed wire to save himself from sliding, and when, with these various disinclinations, he finds himself on a smooth flush deck that is heeled over at an angle of 45 degrees, some of the delights of Solomon Island cruising may be comprehended. Also, it must be remembered, the penalty of a fall into the barbed wire is more than the mere scratches, for each scratch is practically certain to become a venomous ulcer. That caution will not save one from the wire was evidenced one fine morning when we were running along the Malaita coast with the breeze on our quarter. The wind was fresh, and a tidy sea was making. A black boy was at the wheel. Captain Jansen, Mr. Jacobson, the mate, Charmian, and I had just sat down on deck to breakfast. 3 unusually large seas caught us. The boy at the wheel lost his head. 3 times the Minota was swept. The breakfast was rushed over the lee rail. The knives and forks went through the scuppers. A boy aft then went clean overboard and was dragged back, and our doughty skipper lay half inboard and half out, jammed in the barbed wire. After that, for the rest of the cruise, our joint use of the several remaining eating utensils was a splendid example of primitive communism. On the Eugenie, however, it was even worse, for we had but 1 teaspoon among 4 of us. But the Eugenie is another story. Our first port was Su'u on the west coast of Malaita. The Solomon Islands are on the fringe of things. It is difficult enough sailing on dark nights through reef-spiked channels and across erratic currents when there are no lights to guide. From northwest to southeast the Solomons extend across 1,000 miles of sea, and on all the thousands of miles of coast there is not one lighthouse. But the difficulty is seriously enhanced by the fact that the land itself is not correctly charted. Su'u is an example. On the Admiralty chart of Malaita, the coast at this point runs a straight, unbroken line. Yet across this straight, unbroken line the Minota sailed in 20 fathoms of water. Where the land was alleged to be was a deep indentation. Into this we sailed, the mangroves closing about us, till we dropped anchor in a mirrored pond. Captain Jansen did not like the anchorage. It was the first time he had been there, and Su'u had a bad reputation. There was no wind with which to get away in case of attack, while the crew could be bushwhacked to a man if they attempted to tow out in the whaleboat. It was a pretty trap, if trouble blew up. Suppose the Minota went ashore, what would you do? I asked. She's not going ashore, was Captain Jansen's answer. But just in case she did, I insisted. He considered for a moment and shifted his glance from the mate buckling on a revolver to the boat's crew climbing into the whaleboat, each man with a rifle. We'd get into the whaleboat and get out of here as fast as God had let us, came the skipper's delayed reply. He explained at length that no white man was sure of his Malaita crew in a tight place, that the Bushmen looked upon all wrecks as their personal property, that the Bushmen possessed plenty of Snider rifles, and that he had on board a dozen return boys for Su'u who were certain to join in with their friends and relatives ashore when it came to looting the Minota. The first work of the whaleboat was to take the return boys and their trade boxes ashore. Thus one danger was removed. While this was being done, a canoe came alongside manned by 3 naked savages. And when I say naked, I mean naked. Not one vestige of clothing did they have on, unless nose rings, earplugs, and shell armlets be accounted clothing. The head man in the canoe was an old chief, one-eyed, reputed to be friendly, and so dirty that a boat scraper would have lost its edge on him. His mission was to warn the skipper against allowing any of his people to go ashore. The old fellow repeated the warning again that night. In vain did the whaleboat ply about the shores of the bay in quest of recruits. The bush was full of armed natives, all willing enough to talk with the recruiter, but not one would engage to sign on for 3 years' plantation labor at £6 per year. Yet they were anxious enough to get our people ashore. On the second day they raised a smoke on the beach at the head of the bay. This being the customary signal of men desiring to recruit, the boat was sent. But nothing resulted. No one recruited, nor were any of our men lured ashore. A little later we caught glimpses of a number of armed natives moving about on the beach. Outside of these rare glimpses, there was no telling how many might be lurking in the bush. There was no penetrating that primeval jungle with the eye. In the afternoon, Captain Jansen, Charmian, and I went dynamiting